Thank you, honorable colleagues. I've made more references in this chamber than I can remember about this chamber being an independent House of Parliament and how we must operate independently from the other place. And while I will always fiercely defend that principle, which is at the core of our Westminster system, over the past 150 plus years, our two chambers have often demonstrated a will and an ability to work together for the greater good. There are moments in our history where we have come together to speak in one singular, powerful voice. And now we have before us another one of those moments. We have an opportunity right now to come together, like we did earlier on motion item number 4, to stand together, to stand on principle, to be on the right side of history. We have seen it time and again throughout history. Around the world, people turn away, sometimes inadvertently, other times on purpose. They turn away from the atrocities being committed against their fellow men and women. It's not always easy to speak up, to speak out. The reasons can be many, but speaking up, speaking out is the right thing to do. And it is what we, as senators, as parliamentarians, but most and above all as Canadians, we must speak on behalf of our nation and our people. We must represent the fabric of our nation, our values, and we must do so as one solid parliamentary voice. That's why this motion is the same motion that was recently adopted in the House of Commons. And if adopted here, it can truly be said that Canada's Parliament has spoken and has declared what is happening to minority Muslims in Xinjiang region as a genocide. I believe the seriousness and egregious character of what's happening to Uyghur Muslims and others in mainland China is reflected in the fact that senators from all caucuses and groups have sought to draw attention to what's happening and have been so willing to work across party lines in bringing this motion forward. I wish to extend my thanks to my caucus colleague, Senator No, who worked with me on the motion in the last Parliament calling for Magnitsky sanctions against Chinese officials related to this genocide, and thank him for his steadfast support when it comes to human rights. I also would like to thank Senator McFedrin for her outreach on this matter and for agreeing to second this motion, and also being a steadfast supporter of human rights anywhere and all the time. To my good friend, Senator Jaffer, who also expressed her unreserved support, thank you for always being on the right side of history, Senator. Also, Senator, I'd like to thank Senator Munson. I'd like to thank Senator Julie Melville-Duchesne for her unequivocal support. I also want to thank each and every one of you in this chamber that know that we as Canadians have to stand on the right side of these issues. The point is, this transcends politics and political agendas. Colleagues, I do agree with those who call for exercising caution where the use of the word genocide is concerned. It is not something to be thrown around lightly. It does come with certain legal implications for the international community. So we should turn, I think, to the 1948 Genocide Convention for guidance when considering whether particular actions constitute a genocide. In the present convention, genocide is defined as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The 1948 Convention is focused on acts designed to physically destroy a particular group. Since the Convention was formulated in the aftermath of the Holocaust in Europe, there's no doubt as to the context in which the Convention was drafted. There should also be no doubt that what is taking place against minority Muslims in Xinjiang at the hands of the communist Chinese regime is in fact and undoubtedly a genocide. In order to truly appreciate the scope of what's happening, we must go back where it began, starting by noting that the region China refers to as Xinjiang is actually Chinese-occupied East Turkestan. The region, as with all of China, is made up predominantly of Han Chinese, with Uyghur Muslims in the minority. Over the years, an influx of Uyghur Muslims from the regions west into the bustling manufacturing centers of the south has created increasing ethnic tension. These tensions have boiled over throughout the years, sometimes resulting in violent protests. It was against this backdrop, according to documents obtained by the New York Post, that in 2014, President Xi Jinping launched the full force of China's authoritarian regime against the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in the region. Xi has justified his actions then and since as being necessary to deal with who he describes as terrorists. So what does that look like, colleagues? Chinese authorities immediately started rounding up, grabbing them off the streets, snatching them out of their homes, telling family members, including young children, that their loved ones were being sent to training schools, that they might never come back. And while at first the Chinese government denied the existence of these internment camps, when confronted with satellite imagery proving their existence, they referred to them, and I quote, as re-education camps. And even now, Chinese officials try to claim that everyone has completed their training and have been released. But satellite images and family members of those interned say quite the contrary. And what is really happening at these camps, colleagues? Prisoners are subjected to psychological indoctrination, physical torture, including waterboarding, sexual abuse, forced abortions, mass sterilization. There's said to be as many as 300 of these internment camps, averaging 300 acres in size, with many showing signs of expansion over the past year or so. It is believed that as many as 3 million people, or 30% of the Uyghur population, are detained in these concentration camps. And Uyghurs outside the camps are also victims of oppression and forced labor. A report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found that these forced laborers have been working for companies owned by BMW, Nike, Huawei, just to name a few. The threat of being interned for even the slightest infraction is said to have terrorized the entire population into silence. As reported by the BBC, the region is now covered by what is termed a pervasive network of surveillance, including police checkpoints, cameras that scan everything from license plates to individual faces, their expressions, and even discussions amongst these citizens. Cameras are even said to have been located and monitoring individuals in their apartments and homes. And it's not just facial recognition technology that's being used, but also other biometric data, including DNA and voice recognition, with Uyghurs being forced to turn over samples of these to local authorities, as well as being forced to install tracking apps on their mobile devices. This Orwellian level of surveillance has been complemented by a reported campaign of forced sterilization here as well. Documents obtained by the House of Commons Subcommittee on International Human Rights noted about 80% of all IDU placements in China took place in this region. Placements in China took place in this region. Birth rates in the region are reported to have fallen by close to 24% over the last year. And then there are the settlement policies that have sought to swamp the local Uyghur population with large numbers of Han Chinese who have been encouraged to settle in these regions. Colleagues, it is indisputable that this does rise to the level of genocide according to the 1948 Convention. And yet, the communist regime of China not only expects us to believe otherwise, but they continue a campaign of threats and intimidation against Western nations who dare challenge them. In some cases, some countries have been complicit in Beijing's attempts to wipe out the Uyghur population by arresting exiled Uyghurs and deporting them back to China. We should be under no illusion that the Xi regime seeks to silence us as well. They've threatened us. They threatened our colleagues in Parliament with repercussions in the past. But colleagues, we must not allow that to deter us. It certainly hasn't deterred our greatest ally, the United States of America. Several months ago, the United States Senate introduced a bipartisan resolution to hold China accountable for genocide against ethnic Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, and members of our Muslim minority groups, other Muslim minority groups. Two successive administrations, including the current one, as both the current Secretary of State and current Secretary of State have recognized that the actions of the Chinese regime constitute a genocide. And it is happening in full view of the world. The authoritarian state of China is committing these atrocities, these crimes against humanity without impunity. They're arrogant in their blatant disregard for human life and human rights. And we must not allow it to go unchecked and to go unnamed for what it is. We always say, never again. We said it after the Holocaust. And then we had Rwanda, a genocide that had such a profound impact on our friend and former colleague, the Honorable Romeo Dallaire. Former Senator Dallaire has said of what's happening in China, and I quote, "You're either a great nation that believes in its values and what its flag stands for, or what so many have died to defend it. You're either that or you're not." And I couldn't agree more with our former colleague, Senator Dallaire. We can't say we're a nation that defends human rights and religious freedom and then stay silent when we see what's happening in China. We can't stand up against Islamophobia in this country, but not stand up and speak out against the genocide taking place against Muslim people in another. This is not the Canadian way. Never in our history has a nation have we backed down in the face of tyranny, and we shouldn't start now. Our actions as Canadians, ours today as parliamentarians, must be reflective of our values and our long-standing reputation of defenders of human rights, religious freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. We must speak out in one voice and say, no, we will not allow this to happen. Never again. Colleagues, China for far too long, this Chinese regime has trampled freedom and democracy in Hong Kong with a boot to the throat of the people of Hong Kong. We've seen how they behave in terms of disregarding international law in regards to our two Michaels and other Canadian citizens. We've seen how they've been belligerent when it comes to attacking countries and neighbors like Taiwan and India. We need to speak up. We need to hold China to account. We should not be tolerant of a trading ally of behavior that we would never accept in our own country and as Canadians. I hope you will all support this motion. It's taken far too long for such an obvious motion that embodies what Canada is all about and what Canadians believe in, standing up for fellow man who's being trampled by tyranny and by an authoritarian regime. So I don't know what are the forces that are preventing this obvious call on behalf of my colleagues to speak up on behalf of Canadians, but we have an opportunity tonight to speak in one solid voice, to reinforce the House of Commons, to reinforce these Canadian values. And I truly call upon you to make me again proud today as a parliamentarian, standing up for those values in defense of vulnerable minorities that are being trampled by tyranny and by authoritarian oppression. Thank you, colleagues, very much.